Hey guys, we are the 354 Podcast. We're recording this podcast for our Japanese cinema class, and we will be discussing movies, Japanese movies, and themes. Especially today, we'll be looking at the Sisters of Gion, directed by Kenji Mizoguchi. Okay, so does everyone want to introduce themselves?
Awesome, I'll go first. My name is Yobi. I am a big time fan of all sorts of Japanese movies, and I'm really excited to get a chance to talk about the different topics today.
Hi, I'm Selena. I am half Japanese. I have prior knowledge, a little bit of Japanese culture, and I'm interested in talking about these movies, discussing points about Japanese society, and yeah.
I'm Miria from Japan, and I'm a Japanese, but I don't really watch Japanese movies, so I want to explore. I'm interested in exploring Japanese movies.
And I'm Sarav, and I watch a lot of anime. And I'm excited to dive into this movie, Sisters of Gion. So we're starting by discussing the general details of this movie, and I'm going to ask Selena to walk us through some general details and then dive into the Japanese era in which this film was filmed.
Okay, so just a little bit of a background of this movie. This movie was released in 1936. So if you look at the eras, the Showa era actually began in 1926. So it's just 10 years into the Showa era. And what you need to know about this era is that in Japan, this was a time where you could see more and more people leaving the countryside to move to big cities like Tokyo. So it was really a time of urban growth and development. And what comes with that is obviously change in the Japanese lifestyle. So maybe if you could imagine coming from a calm countryside and suddenly getting hit with a new, everything, the whole system is different, especially the salarymen working lifestyle. It's really a stressful change. Everything is now very high pace. It's very city life, as we know today. So people are getting anxious, and this kind of links with our topic of Japanese identity. So at the time, people are getting confused. They were drowning in this really fast modernizing Japan, and they start to question what is Japanese in this modern Japan. So if you could maybe imagine tall concrete office buildings towering over, built on land where once was authentic Japanese scenery with classic Japanese architecture. And now the majority of people are wearing Western clothing, especially suits and workwear. So everything they once knew, everything that was a part of their lifestyle had suddenly changed. And that's something very hard to imagine. And so some people were then questioning, is Japan losing its essence, its Japanese-ness? Everything that they had known to be a part of their Japanese identity had faded away, especially in these big cities. And so that ties into the concept of giri and ninjo, which are the key concepts in the Sister of the Gion.
Thanks for the summary of the time period. Yep, like Selena said, now we're going to dive into some important terms and concepts related to this movie and related to Japanese identity. So we have giri, and I guess I'll go ahead and talk about these concepts. So giri is the idea of obligation to duty. So, for example, a classic example of giri is samurais obeying their lord, their masters, the shogun. The shogun can ask anything of a samurai. You can even ask them to take their own life, and they would do that. That's a sort of older example of giri, but I guess in modern day Japan, giri relates more to the office space, to family, and to relationships. So, for example, if you are working at an office, it is your duty to work the full 8 hours and try your hardest. And so that's giri. Then ninjo is the word for human emotion, and this often comes in conflict with giri. Ninjo is a difficult one to translate into English, but it's emotions that come in conflict with that sense of duty. So, for example, going back to the example using the samurai, let's say the samurai's duty is to obey the shogun, but he falls in love with the shogun's wife. Now, does he obey the shogun, which would mean not follow through with his feelings, or does he follow through with his feelings? And that's the conflict between giri and ninjo. Ninjo being his emotions towards this girl. In a more modern example, ninjo would be perhaps the salaryman who hates his job. And so maybe he has desires to become a musician and is in conflict with working at his job and what he truly wants to do. Yeah, so those are the basic concepts of giri and ninjo. We can dive into that further if anyone else has something they want to talk about in terms of giri and ninja.
I really like the descriptions that you used, the examples that you shared, because I think, especially coming from a Western country, it's a really maybe difficult concept to kind of imagine or kind of a picture, just because it's not something that we have the exact equivalent to in our own kind of culture on the Western side of the world. And it really is something that kind of seems to be a consistent theme in a lot of the films that we are exposed to from Japan, that eternal kind of conflict between giri and ninjo. So I think the examples that you chose are really kind of spot on to kind of help us picture that exactly how they are.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I found this paper that dives into it in far more detail through the use of, I guess, Japanese household sort of fables, I guess you could call them. I'd be happy to read some of those that I found. They, I think, explain these concepts in more detail and better, because though I did just sort of explain what they were, it's really more complicated than that. So here's one that I found. I'll say who this is from. So this is from Seiki Kiyode from Hokkaido University. It's a paper called The Circle of On, Giri, and Ninjo, Sociologist's Point of View. And then, so she provided us with some stories, kind of. So for example, there's an example of, I think this is about giri. No, this is about the conflict between giri and ninja, and this is a good one. Yeah, so there was a big battle between families of Minamoto and Taira, and it took place in the 12th century. It's called the Battle of the Red and White Flags. Towards the end of the battle, Naozane Kumagai, a samurai of the Minamoto family, was fighting an enemy of the enemy's family and strikes him down. He's about to win, and he asks this enemy how old he is because he seems young. And turns out the enemy, whose name was Atsumori, was 16 years of age. So Naozane, he feels this guilt because he has a son who is also 16 and doesn't want to kill Atsumori. And so this is a classic example of conflict between Giri and Ninjo. Giri being he has to obey his master's orders and kill his enemy. Ninjo being just the guilt that he feels at killing someone as young as his own son. So that's a really good one there. Yeah.
Very tough conflict, very conflicting, like emotions and that.
Exactly. Oh, and there was a really good one for Ninja. It's not a story, but a better sort of explanation of the concept. So in this paper, she says, probably there is no equivalent in English, just as with the term giri for ninjo. In a Japanese dictionary, ninjo is translated as the heart or feelings common to man, human affections, humanity, kindness. So the opposite then, and this in Japanese is fu ninjo, is translated as cold-hearted, hard-hearted, inhuman, and unsympathetic. So I think this will be really important, this definition here by Seiki, when we discuss giri and ninjo in the movie, and how Umekichi and Omocha embody these concepts.
Yeah, I think it's really something so deeply integrated into Japanese society that it might be harder for our audiences that aren't as familiar with Japanese identity to understand. So let's just talk within our group here. We have two people very familiar with Japanese culture, and the other two, you guys, I'll just categorize you as not. How would you see yourself maybe in your position in society? Would you, I mean, I'm assuming you would consider yourself as more ninja rather than giri.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yobi, do you want to go first?
It's a really tough thing to kind of describe, I'd say, especially with my own choices that I've made in my life. I could definitely say a lot of the choices I've made were likely not on the giri spectrum of the scale. When you look at what kind of equivalent words they give for giri, like following your obligation or one's duty, a lot of people might find pleasure or happiness in following what is their duty, right? There must be some kind of like happiness or pleasure or fulfillment that comes from that. But again, when I'm looking at it from this lens, this scope, that's what's been explained in the folk tales that you shared and the examples that you shared. It's really, really tough because if I were in that situation, let's say I was the older samurai deciding whether or not to kill the 16-year-old, I think there's really no choice. I would not want to take the 16-year-old's life, especially having empathy, knowing that I have a son. I think I would ultimately kind of side more on the ninja side, and kind of abandon what is my duty. So it's really tough. It's such a tough, it's a conflicting thing, I think, and it's really tough to describe. But yeah, how about you guys?
Yeah, giri and ninja is something I think is pretty applicable to at least Asian cultures, like South Asian culture as well. In India, we have a very strong sense of duty and obligation to our elders, to our families. And it's actually, it's a common movie theme even. You'll see tons of Bollywood movies dive into someone, their parents want them to be a doctor or something, but they want to be something else. And that's a very common theme that you see in Bollywood. Even though this is obviously these are Japanese concepts and they are complex in that they can't really be translated very easily into English, I feel like I have an understanding from the point of view of an Indian and how those concepts sort of manifest in Indian society and Indian culture. But the movie we're about to see, I think, does a really good job of sort of conveying, although subtly, but conveying these concepts.
That's really interesting that you kind of related that to other Asian cultures. And I would say I agree. I mean, although my Asian side would be Japanese, a lot of things I have in common, even with my friends, with my peers that are also Asian and grew up with Asian parents, would probably have very similar conflicts of, their parents pressuring them into pursuing a certain job, like you said, a doctor, when maybe they would rather choose what happiness truly means to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I would be interested to kind of hear Miria's point of view, because Miria, from my understanding, you grew up in Japan.
Yes.
So what does this concept of giri and ninjo mean to you? And would you side with either giri or ninjo?
For me, like recently in modern Japan, the relationship with people is weakening. So I think people act with giri more than ninja. So I think I also act with giri more than ninja.
Would you be able to give us an example in modern society where you would choose giri over ninjo?
Like I live in Tokyo, and especially people in Tokyo are not really warm. So like, for example, if people find people who needs help, they don't really care about them. People who needs help, because it's not their duty. It's not our duty to help people who needs help.
Mm-hmm.
Really
That's really interesting, yeah, because I feel like giri is often associated with this, at least I read about this sort of in how it's translated to English and how it's understood from the outside perspective, the spectator perspective of someone who's not Japanese, is that it's kind of the righteous path to take. But it isn't necessarily that. It's really more contractual. Yeah, it's like an obligation to a master, your family. Yeah, it's a more contractual relationship. Would you agree with that, Miria? Or would you say there is this idea of righteousness that is associated with giri?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Sweet. I think we sort of have talked about the concepts of giri and ninjo and conveyed them well enough. And now, does someone want to dive into geisha? And what is a geisha?
I would say that the Japanese kind of archetype for geisha, they are women who are kind of in a role designed to serve their patrons or designed to serve men at the time, and comfort them. And so that has various different meanings, a wide scale of meanings from drinking to speaking to maybe more. But it was kind of a role that I would find it difficult to fulfill. And I think it's something that especially shifting from the traditional viewpoint or the traditional idea of a geisha to the modern era was something that was definitely a difficult archetype or role for women to take on, especially as we saw in this film. We have a good example of two people that kind of represent two different viewpoints of what it means to be a woman at that time in that role of being a geisha. Does anybody else have any other points to add for the geisha archetype?
Oh, one interesting thing that we'll come across in this movie is that there's like a lower level geisha and a higher level geisha. And basically, they make different salaries. Obviously, the higher level geisha makes more money. They can afford nicer kimonos. They can go to nicer events where wealthier patrons would attend. And this is something that you see is an issue for the two sisters in this movie, as they are the lower level or lower class of geisha. And it's expensive to become a geisha. That's also very important. I mean, from their wigs to the training, the dresses, the kimonos. Usually they require a patron to pay for their lessons and help them get through to becoming geisha. Yeah. Anybody else? If not, we can start talking about the movie, but does anyone have anything else they want to say about geisha?
I think there's also a misconception that geisha equals prostitutes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, that's also the case for some geishas, but it's not just about that. Like what you were saying, it's about serving their patrons and just being a responsible kind of supportive figure to the men. In addition to maybe some like performances as well that they I think some specialize in. Yeah, so they're not prostitutes.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they're entertainers, performers.
Yeah, there we go. That's a better term.
And I'm kind of curious too. Do geishas still exist today in Japan? Is that something that is still seen, or is there a specific area in Japan where there's still people who fulfill that role of a geisha?
I think most geisha is in Kyoto.
And it's dwindling, I think, the culture of geisha, right? Not many people practice. I'm not sure what you would say. Practice the art of geisha, say.
I think it's something more of a life commitment. You're really training to become a better geisha as you go, learn all the steps of being a geisha, mastering it. I don't recall there being too many geishas left in Japan, but one of the famous districts is the Gion, which is perfect for this movie because it happens in the Gion, and this is in Kyoto. And if you like to go visit, it still exists today, and it's very traditional. If you're lucky, you'll be able to see some geishas walking down the streets. So yeah, should we kind of dive into the movie? Yeah.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah. So cool. So far, we've gotten a general, sort of just talked about the general movie details and a summary of the Showa era, the Showa period, when this film was made. We've covered some concepts, giri, ninjo, and geisha. And now we'll start talking about what we believe to be the main theme in Sisters of Gion. I'll use the Noel Burch reading to do that. Just a quick, because he has a really good summary of the plot in here. Okay. Here. Yeah, Sisters of Gion as a narrative is also in many respects the prototype of Mizoguchi's personal mythology. Two sisters, the elder attached to tradition and resigned to the subordinate role of women, the younger determined to make her way in the world, share a house in Gion, the red light district of Kyoto, and practice a relatively low form of prostitution. The elder sister becomes attached to a bankrupt merchant and invites him to live in the house, but the younger sister, Omocha, feels this will cramp her style and contrives to make him leave. At the same time, Omocha has been flirting with a clerk in order to obtain small favors. He lets her have a bolt of kimono silk on credit. His boss learns of the affair and is brought into contact with Omocha, who seduces him. The clerk is fired and retaliates by melodramatically kidnapping Omocha. She leaps out of the speeding car, and we don't really know this part, whether she leaps or is pushed out of the speeding car, but is seriously injured. And as she lies on her hospital bed with her sister weeping beside her, she curses the lot of the prostitute, which I think is just, she really curses the lifestyle of geisha. He talks about prostitution here, but I don't really know if we.
Yeah, I don't think we actually see any signs of prostitution in the movie itself, but I mean, it is possible we just don't see it.
Yeah, some geisha were known to practice prostitution. I mean, it's expensive. You need money. Cool. So that was a basic summary of the plot again by Noel Burch in To the Distant Observer, Form and Meaning in the Japanese Cinema. It's his entry in a journal. And now we can talk about the theme. Miria, would you want to talk about, say what the theme is?
So I think the theme of this movie is women captured in tradition and their conflict. So because Omocha hates the way things are, Omocha hates the way things are in the period-like structure where women aren't valued, and she wants to be independent from society.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yes, I think. I mean, to basically sum up what you just said, like no matter how hard women at the time fought the norm of social conformities, the system remains a male-dominated, very like giddy kind of society.
I think that's right. That's something that'll come up when we get further into the ideas of giri and ninjo in this movie. But yeah, I think Miria got the theme bang on. It's this conflict between giri, sort of, that you could say is more the traditional Japanese lifestyle, and ninjo, which, as Selena mentioned about the Showa era, was a point of concern where people felt they were losing their Japanese-ness, that giri was being lost. So this movie very much is about two sisters, and one ascribing to giri and the other ascribing to ninjo, and kind of the frustration and suffering it causes them.
There's some highlights of the director themselves, the director of the film, Mizuguchi Kenji. And it was highlighted that the main thematic concerns in all his movies is the plight of women. And women are almost always at the center of his films. And one really good quote from the article that I'll cite below is that the women in his films are often in trouble. And it always ends up in defeat because they're always facing a world where men and money rule. So I think that's an important thing to kind of be aware of the director and his works that kind of surround these themes, with women feeling giri-bound and really having no real way to win ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Another interesting thing about Mizoguchi Kenji is that his sister was sold to the geisha.
Mm,
So maybe this was movie and specifically something that he was really, you know, tied into. It was something close at heart. Um, there's also, oh yeah, he also worked as a film onnagata at one point. I don't know if you guys want to keep this in. But I thought that was kind of interesting because, as you mentioned, it's his movie is very it's centered around women, and ironically, he played the roles of women in film style kabuki
hmm
prior to directing movies.
Yeah.
It definitely can probably have a impact on why he decided to, focus on these themes in his movies.
Cool. So the theme is very much giri versus ninjo. And now I think we can dive into some themes that we can also throw up on the screen share.
I think for myself, like one of the first scenes where we just see Mr. Furusawa, who's gone bankrupt, and he has an argument with his wife, and then he just decides to leave. So right off the bat, he's just kind of dismissive of his wife and just walks away. But he actually goes to see Umekichi, the older sister, the one that we know as more tradition and giri-bound. And right off the bat, she offers to let him sell her things if it would help his situation. And so that kind of just showed me immediately, how far or how far she was willing to go just to follow the giri that she felt towards Mr. Furusawa, who was once one of her patrons. And that was a really shocking start for me. I was just like, oh, it just kind of made me like take a step back as I saw it.
That's a very giddy behavior for her to take. But what's also very ironic about that is that Furusawa left his family to go see her, just essentially abandons family, which is a really strong concept in Japanese society. And it's very much tied into giri, right? It's an obligation to kind of be a good father. I mean, they have a child, and he just kind of abandons all that and goes to someone who is extremely loyal and extremely giddy towards him.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely something that we see throughout the film in multiple instances. I think the meaning of giddy for men and women, it might be different in certain situations. We'll see. And then one other interesting scene at the beginning I'll say is our introduction to Omocha, and we get a sense of her take on the world right off the bat. In the notes that we have, it's shown that she did graduate from high school, so that was one thing that was shown as a difference between her and her older sister. She graduated a school for girls, but right off the bat in the beginning, she rejects the fact that Furusawa is staying with her and her sister. Umekichi says, no, we have a duty to him. She uses the word giri. We have giri to him. And right off the bat, Omocha says she hates the word giri. She hates that. And she says that since men are all that way, we should get all we can from them. They just use women for playthings. And Umekichi replies, she knows that. She understands that. She doesn't need her sister to tell her that. However, she still is duty-bound, is giri-bound. So I thought that was an interesting introduction to the dichotomy of those two sisters.
Yeah, I picked up on that one too. And there is this dichotomy in terms of their dialogue, but also just in terms of the visual. So should I share my screen to pull up snippets of the film? Awesome, yeah. Just this image right here. You see Omocha dressed in all white. You see her sister in darker clothing. Omocha is wearing, I suppose, a more Western style gown, and Umekichi is in traditional kimono, as well as she has her wig on for the geishas. And just straight away, these two people are standing facing each other, and there's, even without the dialogue, copious amounts of just traits that are different between the two, which also informs their how one ascribes to giri and the other ascribes to ninjo. And then I think that scene that you were talking about, where she mentions how she hates giri, is right here. So go ahead and just play that really quick.
姉さんは小さい時から車に奉公してきはったから、そりゃそう思わはんやけど、あてらみたい女学校出て芸妓になったようなもんに、あてらみたい女学とそれだけの。
Ah, there it is. Here we go.
姉さんの男派に対する考え方注文が間違ってる高いなっては言うてるのね。だいたいそのギリってやつが気に入らん。ギリがない。何や。
Yeah. Right.
分かってんやったらその通りおっしゃはいな。さきさんがそんな気になる。こっちもええ旦那ができたら取るもんは取っとくのは当たり前よ。そらだそうや。ベタ千一もあらへんような人いそうやらさしといてか。そやけど、黒田藩が俺に気にならんようなどんなことしてくれはったちゅうのえそやおへんかうちが一人前の芸妓なんよ。一人前の芸妓ってないどう見てもこれなら、どなたはんでも満足して楽しんでいただけます。そんなしてくれはっただけやないか。あてらはお金で何歳もにしたり、まるで品物みたいに売り返しはったのは一体誰やみんな男はんや。男はんち男はんみんなあてらの仇や。憎い敵や。それこそあてら男はんちも一目で合わしちゃってもええねん。いい合わしてる。姉さん、おいやとかギリやとか注文に、うまいことごまかされて、男はんの自由にされてはん。
Yeah. This,
Yeah, that was a really powerful scene. Like
Yeah.
all of that, like you don't want to mess with Omocha. She's very stubborn.
Yeah.
She knows what she wants. She's very much ninja. And yeah, I just wanted to point out that it's kind of ironic that she kind of says that, geishas are playthings.
And her name translates to toy.
Exactly.
I didn't realize that one before. That's really cool.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was done on purpose, but if it was very clever.
Mm-hmm. Right off the bat, men are our enemies. We should make them pay and pay. Oof.
And that's really what she tries to do throughout the entire movie too.
Yeah.
Sweet. Is there anything else that can be said about this scene? We spoke about their outfits and the content of their conversation and how that immediately right off the bat creates this dichotomy of giri and ninjo.
Yes. For me, the last scene.
Sure. And the hospital bed, right?
Yes.
いやね姉さん。その不景気なもん目から出して。どうしたんえどうしたんやな。急に国へ帰ってしまはったよ。私何にも言わん。そんなこっちゃ。見とみ。なんぼ実を尽くしても、自分の勝った時には、あつらを捨てていってしまはんや。あつらへんのや。育てへんのや。そういうことだけはしてきたんや。皆さんはもっと喜んでいってくれるや。世間をいっぱい合わせてきたんや。そやけど、それで姉さんは一体どうなった？世間に立派な顔を立てて。それで世間から何をしてもろた？そら、古田さん喜んではったやろ。けど、姉さんはどうなんや？暮らしができるようになったか？黙って言うなりになって、人間になっても、どうもしてくれはれへんね。 商売上手にやったら草津やっちゃって言わはるし、あてらは一体どうしたらええのや。あてらに一体どうせって言わはんねや。なんであてらこの一面ならんやろ。なんで芸妓みたいな商売この世の中にあんじゃ。なんでなけりゃならんねや。こんなもん町またもんこんなもんなかったらええねん。ほんまにこんなもんなかったらええねん。
Yeah, I think this scene strongly reflects the theme of this movie, like women captured in tradition and their conflict. Like to be free from the male-dominated society, like Omocha tries to play along with men, but in the end she is treated badly.
Mhm. There was a really good quote from the Keiko McDonald, who actually wrote an article about the Sisters of Gion. She mentioned these Sisters of the Gion are inflexible, each in their way, acting on her values to the bitter, futile end. Both are defeated by a system that gives them no real power of choice. And I think you picked a perfect scene that represents that. They both made choices and stuck by their values, but ultimately both were kind of left in despair. And
So, what I noticed throughout the film is that the women in this movie could potentially be applied to what's happening in modern Japanese society today. People put on a face to fit into society in order to avoid judgment and criticism, and that is exactly what's happening in the case of Umekichi in the movie. And if you try to fight these conformities, there are obviously consequences, and this applies to Omocha in the movie. So my question was, is Japanese identity already chosen, defined, or laid out for people? There's a social expectation for each role in society, and is following those rules what makes you Japanese? Is Japanese identity something of a whole rather than an individualistic concept? So what do you guys think?
I think Japanese identity is totalitarianism, and following rules makes you Japanese. I think Japanese are always caring what other people think and expect. So Umekichi tries not to defy societal expectations by taking care of Furusawa, who is a patron, and she tries to prove she's one of Japanese. And for Omocha, I can say she wants to be free from Japanese identity. Omocha, who is out of girls' school, hates feudal customs, and she's angry with the reality of geisha being looked down by male. So she's always trying to make her own way, even if it's out of social expectations. And her sister Umekichi is a person who represents Japanese tradition, which Omocha hates. So because of that, Omocha wants to overcome society by getting married Umekichi to Dracdo, because the way to be free from male-dominated society is only getting married to a rich man. So I think Omocha wants to prove that women can be free from male-dominated society by excluding traditional women Umekichi from traditional society.
Yeah, that's really well said. I actually agree with you. I do think that Japanese identity is really tied into the concept of giri, so very much what Umekichi is portraying in the film. But you really summarized that really well. You guys have any other opinions or different answers?
Yeah, I agree. I also think that in terms of giri and ninjo, Japanese society ascribes to giri a lot more. And I think the reason for that is in your question you asked, is Japanese identity, is it something that's collective or is it something that's individual? And I think they sort of the foundation for Japanese identity is for it to be more collective. It's meant to be social. Because the idea behind giri is that it allows for things to flow in societal terms a lot better than if, say, everyone just did what they wanted to and ascribed to their ninjo. And I think that's one of the fears about this losing Japaneseness that was starting to be expressed in the Showa period, is that idea of people not ascribing to giri anymore, and what's going to happen in society if we, um, not ascribe to giri and just follow what we want, our personal desires and everything. So it's definitely, I think, collective, and it was these identities were formed with the intention of creating, a society that meshed well. So that I think also answers the question, like, were these roles predetermined? And I think they were. I think they were predetermined, and they are almost Confucian. They're based on these Confucian ideas. So I say yes. Yes, they are predetermined, and I believe they're more collective than individual.
So would you say in that case, Omocha is almost maybe losing her Japanese identity, but she's doing it voluntarily?
Yeah, without ascribing any like positive or negative connotations to Omocha's actions, uh, just in the sense of traditional Japanese identity, she is just distancing herself for sure from it.
Interesting. How about you, EOB? Do you have any other inputs?
I feel again, yeah, she did definitely ascribe more to Ninjo. I feel like Omocha was almost in her way trying to fight for change and fight for um, a change of what it does mean to be Japanese and a Japanese woman. It's really tough to kind of know exactly what was going on in her mind, but a lot of the points in the movie she kind of says very clearly, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of emotion behind what she must have experienced up until that point in her life. And as you mentioned, like if we compare it to what does it mean to be Japanese today, is it something that, this is over 100 years ago, basically. I believe the film was made in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken. So we're 100 years later, kind of looking back on it, and it kind of makes me think about what is it like today for women in Japan. In the news, we just heard the Tokyo Olympic Committee president make such sexist remarks,
Oh,
and
yeah.
yeah, so that was something that was interesting that came up in the news, saying that if women are allowed to speak at the meetings, they need to have their time limited because they talk too much. And at first when I heard that, I was like, well, uh, it's something that you hear often in Japan, sexist remarks like that. But however, this time it looked like they actually acted on it and they actually elected. First, they made him resign, and that now they've actually elected a female as the president. So I almost feel like, people are fighting for change in their own ways, and it does take a long time. So it might have been a battle that's started over 100 years ago with Omocha fighting for redefining Japanese identity, and it's still a battle that's going on today.
Very well put. Thank you. So
So for the next question, something that came up in my mind was just comparing, um, you know, the way that we see men make their decisions in this movie and the way that the women make their decisions in this movie. And the theme of Giri and Ninjo we see very well represented with the decisions of the sisters. One being more duty bound and the other trying to fight for her own definition of happiness. But every time we would see the men make decisions, it seems like there are instances where they weren't following Giri and just kind of pursuing Ninjo, whether it was Furusawa just leaving his wife on a dime and going over to Umekichi's house and deciding to live with them, whether it's the man selling the kimono fabric or just giving it to free to Omocha. We just see the men keep making decisions on a whim. So what do you guys think? I was wondering, does it have a different meaning for men compared to women, both of Injo and Ninjo?
Yeah, so just before we start discussing that, I actually wanted to highlight why this is a good question, and it's something that has been deliberated before. So I found this journal, and the article title in the journal is called Japanese Film and Women, the Works of Mizuguchi Kenji and Naruse Mikio, and it's in the Review of Japanese Culture and Society journal. And this specific article was written by Masako Kamimura and Ishikawa Yumi. And I'll just read an excerpt that highlights why this is an important question, and it is something that is a common, I think, discussion that takes place when watching Sisters of the Gion. So the excerpt goes, in this film, Mizoguchi was particularly attentive to the theme of feminism through the heroine Omocha, which means toy in Japanese, played by Yamada Isuzu. Mizoguchi severely criticized the exploitation of women in the male-dominant society and the Japanese cultural ideals of giri and ninjo, which forced women to exercise patience and submit to self-sacrifice. So there he uses words such as exploitation. There's clearly some bias of giri and ninjo where women have to exercise patience and they have to submit to self-sacrifice, but we clearly don't see the males doing the same. Anyway, so I just wanted to highlight that this is a solid question, and it is in literature too. Yeah, so I have some stuff to say about this, but if someone wants to go in and chime in first, that's yeah.
I do agree with your passage that you shared for us. There definitely is a bias, and you definitely do see it in the movie. It's pretty evident when you see that the men have more of a flexibility. They do run back and forth from ninjo, and I guess it would be mostly ninjo, but ninjo and giri. Like they, for example, Mr. Furusawa at first, when he abandons his family to go see Umekichi, like I would definitely consider that more of a ninja kind of action on his part. But at the same time, when at the end of the movie, he does go back to his family. And I think family definitely ties into more of a giri aspect of Japan. So, yes, definitely a bias. I do agree with that.
I feel like men act with giri when it's in their interests. So to touch on the fact that Furusawa returns to his family in the end, I believe that it was mentioned that he received a job where he would be leading a factory of some sorts. So ultimately, that would be in his best interest to return where he has the opportunity for a successful job. Similarly, we see Jurokado when Omocha kind of mentions lying, saying that Umekichi is interested in Mr. Jurokado. Um, he said that he couldn't act on it because he used to do business with Mr. Furusawa, and so he even mentioned I have giri to him, but ultimately if Umekichi was going to break things off, he would be willing to pursue that relationship. So he kind of he cites he's giri bound, but if it's going to work out for him in the end and he's going to be able to have a relationship, he was willing to act on it. So it's kind of interesting to see how they only act when it's in their interest.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that means they do have that flexibility of juggling multiple options. Whereas if we see a woman doing what these men were doing in the movie, like, I don't think it would end up well. I mean, we do see that at the end of the movie, both Omocha and Umekichi end up, I guess, in a sense, losing. No matter what they do, they're just given no choice. But men do have a choice.
Yeah, and it's deeply rooted actually, the sort of division of expectations, even among Giri and Ninjo, than among the genders. So I found this journal, that's the Journal of International Women's Studies, and this article is Japanese Gender Role Expectations and Attitudes, a qualitative analysis of gender inequality. And they kind of dive into, I guess, the sort of the like, where did Japanese gender roles get assigned? When were they assigned, and what are they assigned to be? So Japanese society sort of ascribes a role to women, and it's changed over the course of time. But ultimately, the current expectations are sort of like founded in these historical norms where the women are expected to stay at home, and as opposed to their husbands, who are supposed to go seek out jobs and bring in income. So again, I mentioned with Selena's question earlier that the way giri being a collective value, a value that ensures society to flow well and not come across too many hiccups, is this also sort of is a foundational thing that determines the gender roles in Japanese society. So, for example, in this article that I mentioned, they say that the purpose of these gender roles and the way they were assigned was to allow conformity and balance in accordance with Confucian teachings. So, conformity and balance in society, it built an identity for both men and women that could be shared, but it allowed women less freedom than their male counterparts. And so, really, Giri and Ninjo are different for men and women simply because gender expectations, gender roles, and the expectations assigned to them, that is far more foundational, I think, than the values of Giri and Ninjo, are biased in a way and determined. Um, what do you guys feel like, EOB, you brought up the event that just occurred and how it was handled with the, did you say Olympics, was it?
Yeah, it was the president of the Olympic Committee had made some sexist remarks, and at first he refused to I don't know, apologize, but he refused to resign. But there was continual calls for him to resign, and eventually he did resign recently, and then they appointed a female as the new president. So I think that was done so on purpose to kind of reflect, hopefully, some changes in um, maybe cultural norms.
Yeah, exactly. That's sort of my follow-up question is, this movie sort of captured the biases of Giri and Ninjo according to your gender, and that was way back in the Showa era. Um, I don't live in Japan, but I guess I can ask Selena and Miria, do you feel like there's still a strong influence of the ideas I just outlined with what the expectations of women are and male men are, and how that is supposed to allow for conformity and balance, but just allows less freedom for women? Do you feel that's something that's being tackled now, or there's still a lot of work left to be done?
I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but there definitely has been like drastic changes since the Showa era. Women, it's normal now for women to go to work. It's not all necessarily, what's that term, good wife, wise mother, or yeah, that whole ideal of women staying at home taking care of the house and the children. that's really more, yeah, I honestly don't see that as often anymore, which is a great start, I would say. But you do still see disadvantages that women do experience in regular life, whether it's at work or, even in the political field as well. There are less women. Actually, it's mostly men. And so there are still a lot of battles that they're going to have to fight to overcome all these gender differences and how they are treated in society even today. What do you think, Miria?
Yeah, I think Japan conscious of the world. Like they want to be more globalized. So Japan is trying to raise the status of women. So for example, for Tokyo Olympic, the member of committees have only few women. So they're trying to hire more women, like more than 40% women. I mean, they're trying to hire women to make committee have more than 40% women.
Nice.
Really interesting too, like, as Japan becomes more globalized, hopefully they do try to adapt more. But there's an interesting news article that I read a few years ago where women were banned from being able to approach sumo rings. It's like a century-old tradition. And so there was an instance where a politician was having some type of heart attack or something like that near the ring, and a woman tried to rush to help him nearing the sumo ring, and she was shooed away. Has anyone come across that story before?
No, it's the first time
No?
I hear of it.
Yeah, it's in the Japan Times. So like in the last few years, there have been attempts where women would like try to rush and touch the ring. So it's not something that I use as an example um, often, but it just makes me kind of reflect that there's still some really stiff, difficult traditions that have yet to be bent in any way.
So, in terms of if Japanese identity is something that's already laid out for the people, if the idea of Japanese identity is something of a whole rather than an individualistic concept, I would say as a group, we collectively talked about how Japanese identity is definitely tied into the concept of giri, and really it is your choice to whether you follow these rules or not. But um, in the case of Umekichi, she does follow all the rules. She is very much giri, and still there are challenges that she has to overcome as a woman in society, and these are things that we still see in modern society today.
And when it comes to the second question in regards to um, Japanese identity and men and women and the difference between giri and ninjo for both sexes, I think we do have some great examples that reflect that there are differences when it comes to what it means, giri and ninjo for men and women, based in tradition, based in just societal norms. But hopefully, eventually, we'll continue to see progress and growth and change